the fight for Indian independence required several different modes to achieve this change. This resulted in across a wide spectrum that ranged from approaches of Ahimsa, like the Dandi March, to those as extreme as the ones that Subhash Chandra Bose did engage in. We think in status quo, at the point at which we continuously overplay the idea of Ahimsa in all our history textbooks, we craft our identity as Indians necessarily being intertwined as one with Ahimsa. On government, we find it problematic that this takes away from the credits of what several other freedom fighters did indulge in. It's a huge disservice in that we don't pay reverence to the actions that they did, which were just as important and just as much as a contributing factor in achieving this independence. We tell you that this narrative has percolated to such an extent that we today see it merely as a struggle for independence, ladies and gentlemen, when in reality what we think it was a fight for independence, right? A fight that required various actions, including those of violence. We think that this war wasn't won on just grounds of Ahimsa, and we think it's an insult to the recollection of the efforts of those who indulge in practices otherwise. And on government, we're going to talk to you about three things. Firstly, what the role of history books are in shaping the narrative surrounding Indian independence. Secondly, why we think that's a huge misconception currently in the way that India got its independence. And thirdly, why this hinders our ability to craft our identity as an Indian. Clarification, right? Now, when we mean that we should actively downplay the narrative of Ahimsa in our history books, we don't mean that we will obviously be eradicating all instances wherein Gandhi and other leaders did engage in measures of Ahimsa. We think there needs to be equal importance and weightage given to all other forms as well, which means that currently in status quo, what we see is that there's maybe a paragraph or two in every history textbook about other measures that other freedom fighters did engage in, but the overarching idea is that it was only this particular form of Ahimsa that was able to get people independence, right? We think in downplaying this narrative, we ensure that there's more space for alternatives and recounting other instances that also happened, right? So on the first issue, in terms of what we think the role of the history book is, right, in terms of recollecting this narrative. Now understand that the history book is the first point of contact that any individual comes with, in the sense of them trying to understand and recollect what actually went on to, what actually led India to where it is today, right? And we think that this is largely the narrative around which you craft your identity and the narrative around which you view your oppressor, right? And we think thirdly, it's often also the entry point to which people tell you that these are the things that you should feel proud of or an Indian, right? Or these are the leaders in particular that you should emulate, and these are the characteristics of them that we should place special emphasis on. We think what this has done is that this has largely colored the view in which we view the entire struggle, the entire fight for independence as a whole. Because what we tell you the prerogative of these history books should be in terms of recounting this narrative is that they should look at the culmination and amalgamation of all these actions that ultimately fruition into change. Because what we argue to you is that all of these were equally important in us getting to where we are today. Which leads me to my second constructive in terms of why we think there's a massive misconception in the way that Ahimsa is overplayed and why we think that this is something that needs to be counted, right? First of all, while we don't want to discredit the efforts and actions in terms of what Ahimsa did get us, we think that what has happened as a symptom of this constant overplaying of Ahimsa is that Gandhi has single-handedly become the face of Indian independence, right? And was the single entity involved in ensuring that this independence was achieved. What this has done, Mr. Speaker, is that this has placed an implicit judgment to suggest that other mechanisms aren't of that much of a historical significance as others, right? And we think it's a huge injustice to the other people who also ought to be credited, right? Because we think the current way in which, we think there are two direct harms as a result of this, right? First of all, we think the way to which it's overplayed, and we think history books need to recount the entire picture of what necessarily happened, right? Which means currently, they don't really look at what happened, what were the problems with dealing with the Britishers in the manner of Ahimsa. Because we think to a large extent, what this culture of Ahimsa did was that it pushed the struggle behind a huge couple of years, right? To the extent that it prolonged the struggle, and we had to be under the subjugation for a far longer period of time. But this culture of tolerance that Ahimsa generated meant that it gave Britishers a further room for us to appropriate their culture, for them to appropriate our culture and get away with it, right? We don't think that currently, to the extent to which the idea of Ahimsa is lionized and held in great social significance, we don't look at it objectively in terms of what other things it could have done. And we think history books have the imperative to do this. But we think there are several other instances that aren't really given enough importance to, and we think this is problematic, right? Because what we tell you is that when Mangal Pandey, in terms of starting and ensuring the spark for the revolt of 1857, right? In terms of him refusing to bite the cartridge that was given to him, we think he necessarily became the face of the sepoys, and indulging in violent mechanisms ensured that this internal mutiny was the genesis for the independence as a whole. We think so far, in the way that these narratives are overplayed, we think the way that we look at it is either we admonish in such instances, right? To the extent wherein we view Ahimsa as the ideal that all independent movements should strive towards, we necessarily learn to delegitimize other forms of protest, other forms that could have possibly resulted in violence as well, right? And we think Ahimsa has largely been hijacked, the narrative of Ahimsa has highly been hijacked by oppressors as well, right? Because the way they're able to paint it is to suggest that people didn't necessarily have to die, right? That all the Indians had to do was ask for independence and they were willing to give it. But we think this is a huge oversimplification and a reduction of the issue. Because the first image that comes to us when we speak of Ahimsa or the struggle for independence isn't one of war, right? Isn't one of violence. But we think in reality, we have to come to terms with that it was what it was in itself. Because understand this, all these other people who engaged in methods of violent protest were the ones who provided the jolt to a large extent to necessarily instigate and initiate this kind of a fight for independence, right? We think disrupting state structures in a violent manner showed to people that the institution of the British Empire wasn't one that was infallible, but could largely be taken down, right? And we think things like what Subhash Chandra Bose did, right, which is to say he ran slogans of "Give me blood and I will give you freedom." Yeah, that. And we think methods like these are largely underplayed and aren't given as much significance in status quo. And what we think this has largely done, Mr. Speaker, is that this has taken away from the credit that a lot of these other people have achieved in terms of getting us this independence, right? We think the biggest problem is that across generations, at the point at which we value only one form of protest over the others, we think as an Indian collective, we start to forget what was involved in framing this Indian identity as a collective, right? We think we learned to forget what were the various kinds of efforts that different freedom fighters necessarily engaged in terms of them getting us this ultimate freedom. We think history books today have the implicit obligation for them to ensure that there's equal credit given to everybody in terms of them not doing a disservice to all the freedom fighters who did give us independence. For these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, we on side opposition believe that being historically inaccurate with a greater aim of having greater social good as compared to being historically accurate and like fucking up the society is something that we are not proud of, right? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that whatever the point their entire case has been this idea that we need to do greater service to like other freedom fighters because like these people deserve some kind of value, right? The basic question that has run through the mind of side opposition throughout the first speech is what is the value in doing them service as side proposition wants you to believe, right? We tell you that the means of protest that these people employed, the means of fighting against the British Empire as they wanted to call a fight, we tell you that these are violent means. We tell you that these are means, if inculcated by the people of the country in status quo in 2016, will lead to like greater social harm than social good, right? Mr. Speaker, certain rebuttals before I move on to my constructives. Number one, they come and tell us that other freedom fighters can be given like value. They come and tell us like other freedom fighters haven't been given enough like respect, right? We tell you that okay, then just like have more chapters in the history textbooks and go ahead and like give other freedom fighters enough value if that is what you want to like be historically accurate, right? But on the other paradigm in which we believe, right, we believe that this debate is about like the narrative of Ahimsa, right? We tell you that their entire argument has been in a context wherein like India has just gained independence and like is going to like write the history books at the first instance, right? We tell you that is not what the debate is about. To be in 2016 in an atmosphere of like social chaos and like where every single community wants its rights and demands to be heard is something wherein the narrative of Ahimsa comes into picture, right? Mr. Speaker, we further tell you that their entire argument of like other freedom fighters like Subhash Chandra Bose etc. having different means of protest, right? We ask them what are these means of protest. We tell you that these are essentially violent means, which mean that if these are added to the history textbooks and these are glorified as compared to the current status quo of like Ahimsa being glorified, we tell you what essentially happens is people and students and who eventually grow up to like be adult citizens of the country essentially imbibe and inculcate these value of violence, and they start believing that if you want your demands to be met and your needs to be your grievances to be addressed, then you can use violent methods. And we believe that this is bad for the society, right? Mr. Speaker, 5 points of constructives. Number one, what is the context of Ahimsa, right? We tell you that this ideology of Ahimsa works on two manners, right? Number one, it tells us that if you are a believer of Ahimsa, you must believe in peaceful protest, right? We tell you that this idea that you must follow procedure and you must indulge in process and try to bring about an organic change in a manner wherein if you want your demands to be accepted by people in power, you must gather enough support in the people first, right? And how does this happen? We tell you that this happens by means of, by means of discussion and dialogue, right? We tell you that you can't just go ahead and place your demands in front of an authority of power, right? We tell you that if you galvanize enough people with your ideology and if they believe in your ideology, we tell you that eventually you gain support and this is how you meet your demand, right? Which has become the second idea of how Ahimsa functions is through the means of tolerance, right? We tell you that this is an important one. We tell you that Ahimsa teaches people that you need to pay attention to the other person's point of view, right? We tell you that this particular ideology, that since you have an ideology, that since you have a belief that you consider to be legitimate, no other belief can possibly stand in opposition to this, is something that has to be addressed, right? We tell you that this idea that other people's point of views can also be legitimate is something that is good and makes people more understanding and reduces violence in the society at large, right? Which is because the second idea of what are history textbooks, and they spoke about only the first part of it, right? We agree with them when they tell us that history textbooks essentially teach kids and teach kids in school and people in colleges, etc., about certain values that were essentially propagated by our freedom fighters, right? But we tell you on the second idea of what have history textbooks done till now, which is create a narrative of Ahimsa, right? We tell you that because of this narrative of Ahimsa, people have now started placing certain primitive desires like revenge, etc., over people have started placing ideas of non-violence, peaceful protest over ideas of revenge, etc., which are primitive in nature, right? And we tell you that this is good for the society. Mr. Speaker, moving on to the present context in which we do debate this and not in the context they have provided, we tell you what is status quo in India. We tell you that in status quo, we have an idea of jingoism going around, right? We tell you that ever since the BJP has come into power in 2014, this idea has essentially increased in the society, that certain communities believe that they are better than the others, right? We give you the example of the beef ban, right? We come and tell you that the RSS, because it believes that certain Hindutva practices and Hindu way of life need to be accepted by other people in the society, they essentially start going and practicing ideas of mob violence, right? We tell you that if Ahimsa is not given the value that it has been given, and we tell you that in spite of the idea that Ahimsa has been given value, this is happening in an event that they want Ahimsa to be devalued. The idea that violence is something as practiced by Subhash Chandra Bose, etc., has to be valued. We tell you that this idea of mob violence, etc., will be increased in society, and we tell you that this is bad. It essentially leads to loss of life in people. It leads to communal disharmony, and we essentially tell you that life become unstable for a common Indian, right? We further tell you that in status quo we have multiple dissatisfied communities, right? We tell you that after fifth, we tell you that communities such as the Dalits in Una, Gujarat, right? We tell you that the idea that they have adopted a peaceful means of protest of 5,000 people gathering at one place and protesting against the atrocities being done to them. We tell you that we believe in their means of protest, right? We tell you that had these people not been taught the idea of Ahimsa, but rather been taught ideas of devaluing Ahimsa and valuing violence instead, we tell you they would have essentially planned and plotted to kill Modi and the Gujarat CM, right? We tell you that these are essentially bad things which make the state unstable, right? Mr. Speaker, on the fourth idea of what happens when Ahimsa is devalued, we identify in side opposition 4 harms, right? Number one, we tell you that in countries such as America, etc., wherein the narrative that has been going on is that if you are strong enough and if you are powerful enough, you can just go and kill or you can just destroy the other entity which does not believe in your ideology and essentially come out as the victor, right? We tell you that ideas of America being strong arming Japan by just simply dropping a nuclear bomb on them, we tell you this kind of ideology that promulgates in America is something that makes the culture that believe in violence, etc., right? We further tell you on the second idea of how India's international image is defeated if Ahimsa is devalued, right? We tell you that the idea that India has a particular kind of trust in the world because of this idea that since India's father of the nation is Gandhi and he believed in Ahimsa, India essentially believes in Ahimsa, right? We tell you that in spite of facts of India not signing the NPT and CTBT, we tell you that other nuclear nations and other nations in the world essentially believe that India will not cause harm to them in spite of the fact that they have nuclear weapons, right? We tell you that because of the trust that India has been able to go on with their economy and better trade relations and better relations in general with all the nations in the world, right? We tell you that if Ahimsa is devalued, this will also suffer. Mr. Speaker, on the third idea of how the Indian government now at large will now be forced to become an aggressor, right? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that after instances of 26/11 of the 2001 parliament attack, etc., we tell you that people were indeed enraged about how could this kind of injustice be done to us, right? We tell you that it is because of the idea of Ahimsa that people understood that it is through diplomatic means that we have to solve this issue and not use violence and force against the people, right? We tell you that the primitive ideas that people hold of revenge, of massacre, etc., of essentially satisfying their primitive needs has been triumphed by the narrative of Ahimsa as it exists in status quo, right? We tell you that why is the narrative so important? Otherwise, what happens is now people come at large and start demanding from the Indian state that since we believe in violence, you will have to believe in violence, and you have to essentially go at war with like any country that causes harm to India, right? We tell you that this is bad because of like, in spite of the capabilities, India will like suffer like human loss, India will suffer economic loss, etc. Right? We tell you this will also suffer like also the trade relations that India enjoys will suffer. On the fourth idea of how in status quo the society frowns upon violence, and this is something that is good. It will be spoken about my deal for all these ones very good.
Mr. Speaker, the problem with the case that came out from side opposition is that the idea of India being associated with non-violence is already intrinsic in nature, right? So we don't think that link, right, to the violence protests suddenly becoming more rampant in society is really there in the speech that the LO just gave you, right? We tell you this non-violence that is associated with the Indian identity isn't going to suddenly disappear. What we tell you is the reverence that we associate with the leaders who followed the practices of Mahatma Gandhi and the ideals of Ahimsa, right? We need to give the same sort of reverence to other freedom fighters who contributed to the freedom struggle, right? To the war of independence. And who are we talking about? We are talking about people like Bhagat Singh, like Chandrasekhar Azad, like Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad. All these people also significantly had to go out of their way of their lives, right? People often think that non-violence is the only place, or this satyagraha was the only place where you have to sacrifice a large amount of your personal life to go out there and do something for the country, right? We tell you this same reverence isn't associated with the actions of Bhagat Singh, right, who left home at the age of 17 when he was getting into an extremely good college, right, where he gave up the good life that he could have had under the regime of British imperialists, and in fact decided he was going to fight them eye for eye, right? And we tell you he didn't agree with Mahatma Gandhi, but he mutually respected the idea that there were two ideals pushing for the same end goal, right? And we tell you that is what made the Indian freedom struggle so wholesome and so successful in the larger run, right? Which is what ended up happening and culminating in the idea that 1947 happened, right? And we tell you that is why their ideas, right? Because again, there are multiple examples that the Indian society is already pretty intolerant and violent, right? We don't think the idea of adding a few more chapters and downplaying the importance of Ahimsa in the freedom struggle is suddenly going to cause the Dalits to become violent and start shooting people. In fact, we think the way the protests work today are already pretty violent, right? Where people come out on the streets and completely shut down cities to the point where people can't even go out and live their day-to-day lives, right? So we tell you there is no actual benefit on their side of propagating this narrative of Ahimsa, right? What we do tell you exists on their paradigm is historically inaccurate fact reporting, right? And we are principally against this line that opposition has taken, right? Because we tell you people are doing things like honor killings, revenge killings, and like jingo, and people involve themselves in jingoism all the time. In fact, the principle that jingoism often revolves around is misinformation, right? The same kind of misinformation that has existed because of the narrative of Ahimsa for so long within our history textbooks, right? But let's also talk about what the harms that exist on their side of the house exclusively, right? And these harms exist in places such as the international forum, right? We tell you China really doesn't care about India's voice or the constant request to move out of places like Arunachal Pradesh, because China necessarily views India as something that won't retaliate, right? We think that it is of no use to preserve this idea of India never attacking first, or India being someone who will take it all or be tolerant to your actions, when there is a need for actions in places such as Kashmir, right? Where we need to kick the Pakistanis out of the Pakistani occupied Kashmiri territory, right? And we tell you Ahimsa is not the way it's going to happen in Kashmir. Ahimsa is not the way it's going to happen in Arunachal Pradesh, and people desperately need these things to happen in these places, and that's why we think they've failed, right? But also let's talk about where violence is a part of the historical context of people, right? Places like Ireland, right? Where NRA was intrinsic to the Irish people being free of the oppressors who were also again the Britishers, right? We tell you they are able to associate themselves with the NRA movement and give it equal respect while also not engaging in shootings every day, right? The Irish society isn't a violent society just because they accept and understand that the NRA was intrinsic for their fight for freedom, right? And that's why we don't think their case made too much sense. what is an insult, right? The idea that Ahimsa was the single major to our fight for independence or a struggle for independence is an insult to the idea of the Indian freedom movement as a whole. Because let's talk about what people do when they hear, after they have passed through all our history textbooks, right? After they have read all our history textbooks, they often go out and callously pass value judgments on the actions of people who were fighting for a freedom struggle they didn't know the outcome of, right? Which means these people were ready to put their lives on the line, not knowing what the outcome was, whether they would see India free in their own lifetime or whether they would die in front of a bullet, right? Also, we think there's a problem with the narrative that surrounds the Indian freedom movement, right? And it allows the British often to get away with what they had done, with the kind of atrocities that they committed in India before 1947, right? We think people necessarily don't imagine a war, right? When you imagine the Indian freedom struggle, all you're thinking about is a room full of people sitting quietly protesting something, right? But we tell you, there were bullets fired, right? There were people hanged all the time. The British were coming out in the streets and slaughtering us like cows, right? And we tell you, this burden should not be forgotten, right? Like the people who are going to form an intrinsic part of society in a bit, who are going to form an intrinsic part of our society in the future, right? Our children, right? Not my children, like children in general, right? So these people need to remember the importance that this fierceness, the fierceness that was embodied by this facet of the Indian freedom movement, right? They need to remember it so that they too can embody it at some point in their life, right? We think there is value to being bold, and we think this is often downplayed because people they're constantly being told to be tolerant, and we think this translates onto the middle class, but more on that, yes.
So what is the tangible benefit of historical accuracy?
Historical accuracy, you're not you don't encourage the idea that you can misreport facts just to pass a narrative off because it's beneficial to society, right? We tell you BJP uses the same tactics in the idea that Hindutva is the major idea around India, right? When in fact we started off as a secular country, it was very clear in our constitution, and this kind of fact morphing is what we're against, right? And we tell you, right from misreporting on the Indian independence itself is going to perpetuate the same culture across all the chances, right? But also the Indian middle class is often seen as meek, right? It is often seen as a bunch of people who are really not ready to go out in the streets and fight for the rights that they so desperately need, right? And we tell you, these people often don't recognize the power they have in the numbers that they have, right? They often don't think they need to make the sacrifice for the kind of things that they demand in society, right? Which is why you don't see this room full of people fight the Modi government to repeal the crazy beef ban that exists across the country in a lot of places, right? And we tell you, if that is the need of the hour, we won't do it because we are ingrained with the idea that tolerance, that taking it, that being non-violent and necessarily criticizing violence again and again is something we as the people of India need to do constantly, right? We tell you, what we're not saying is you don't have to completely destroy Gandhi from the textbooks, right? But give equal reverence to the people who also played an equally important part of igniting the spark that started the freedom struggle. For all these reasons, we're very, very proud.
First, I'll rebut the essential nature of its case, and then I'll come to the specific points and tell you why they're stupid, right? First one, about how historical accuracy, and this is essentially their constructive case, that you need to do justice to Chandrasekhar Azad and Subhash Chandra Bose, except when Iyer asks you that what happens when people start emulating Subhash Chandra Bose. For example, if the Maoists today start justifying their movement for a freedom struggle by forming an army in the likes of the Indian National Army, is that a legitimate justification of them being violent? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that historical accuracy is something which we are completely fine with sacrificing for the better social good, and I'll talk to you about all those social goods in a bit, right? But the second idea about how violent happens anyways in the society. Mr. Speaker, I don't see as to why, if violence happens anyways, you want to exacerbate it by telling people that, you know what, Subhash Chandra did, Chandrasekhar Azad did it, and hence you can do so either. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that you need an ideological counter narrative to this idea of violence, right? Because Iyer characterized the idea of violence for you as something which is primitive and which comes easy in the after fight, something which comes easy and is primitive in the age of jingoism, right? You have sectionality, you have sectional differences in sex, races, you have caste, you have religion, right? In a country with so many ideological and cultural differences, we tell you that people are easily provoked, right? And all of us know that how easily Indians are provoked. We tell you that the only ideological counterintuition that you will have in to not kill a Muslim that you don't like will be the fact that, you know what, my father of the nation is Mahatma Gandhi, and he inculcated a national value in everyone, which is something which is respected, and even if it is overplayed, we tell you that overplay results in even more veneration of that idea, and we tell you that that particular veneration of that idea is what is exactly the counter incentive that you need for violence to not happen in the society. Mr. Speaker, now coming to like specific rebuttals. First, they like contradicted their own case when they say that, you know what, Indian people still come on the roads, and then they said that no, the middle class is seen as weak. Mr. Speaker, we go and protest about everything. We go and protest about things we don't need to protest about, right? This Patel reservation in like Gujarat, right? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that ridiculous ideas like that are used for like protest, right? And so we say that in situations of that sort, you can't possibly say that, you know what, A, Indian people come on roads, and B, Indian people are meek, because that's an inherent contradiction that you're making after 5. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that like this idea of non-violence and this is a very major clash which happens in this debate, right? That non-violence won't disappear from the Indian society if this narrative does not run in the book. Let me take this down, right? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that you can't restrict the idea of narrative in the history books only to the academia, right? Just saying that history books are the only place where you get this narrative from is something which is not correct. We believe it's not in the spirit of the motion to restrict it only to literally history books, right? You need to talk about the context which is, the narrative which is spread by these history books and the text which is in them. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that when you downplay this idea in history books, it's not as if that you are just textually downplaying this idea, you are downplaying the whole idea as a whole, right? The fact that non-violence is something which is relevant and something which is good is something which is downplayed. And how does this happen, Mr. Speaker? Let me take the example of a country like Israel or United States of America, which was founded on the basis of violence, right? Where people recognized that you had to literally fight with guns with the British and have a proper fucking war in order to ensure that you gained independence. That, in contrast to the Indian independence struggle, in which the national ethos and values that come out of it is the fact that like even if you want to get something as big as your independence, non-violence and truth and like tolerance is something which is enough, right? Mr. Speaker, what happens in United States of America and why is it vilified globally, right? Because people think that whatever, after 5 please sit down, people think that whatever they want and government thinks that whatever it wants, it can be the big daddy because it has the force to do so, and hence goes ahead and represses people. Like for example in Afghanistan, Iraq and all those places, what happened in all those places? The fact that America refused to like negotiate in a civil manner and rather chose bombs over like talks has resulted in ISIS today and did result in Al-Qaeda yesterday. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that India cannot follow in the footsteps of a country whose historical narrative has been regarding that violence is something which is good for you because violence is something which got us independence in the first place. Mr. Speaker, we agree that if you go about historical accuracy, then non-violence might have been necessary at that point of time. But the moment you overplay that idea right now and downplay the idea of non-violence and tolerance being something which are enough for getting something as big as independence, then you get a historical precedent and a historical justification to go ahead and say that, you know what, Subhash Chandra Bose was right in doing it, you glorify him, why do you glorify me as a Maoist who's trying to fight for my rights by forming an army? Yes, your question.
The narratives we speak about happened in a widely different social context. Why do you think it's going to inspire?
Precisely right. In the widely different social context, we tell you that today India is more divided and more like divided along religious and caste lines than it ever was. In the age of jingoism, where people are like killing people for eating something that they don't like, we tell you that in this context, it is even more harmful if you let this precedent be in the society and perpetuate that, like, you know what, these sort of people who are very nice did it and hence you can do it too. Mr. Speaker, now, there were other reports. Yeah, this idea that you don't retaliate. They came and said that, like, you know what, this idea of India runs in the global narrative that India won't retaliate whatever happens. I don't see how that is possible considering we fought 4 wars and won 3 of them, right? In fact, what the idea which is perpetuated is not that you won't retaliate, but the fact that you won't fire the first shot. The whole thing that India has right now, this idea of no first use policy which India has, right? What does this doctrine say? That we will not use nuclear bombs against you unless you do so first with us, right? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that is why the global, like, every country trusts us and says that, you know why, and the reason they think that they, like, will not use the nuclear bomb first and go ahead and sign nuclear deals with us in the face of the fact that we haven't signed THBT or the NPT, they realize that these people will do so because non-violence and like tolerance is something which is inherent to their national values and culture. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that why would, like, today if Pakistan comes and says that, you know what, I won't use a nuclear bomb first either, please sign a nuclear deal with me, will that happen? No, right? Because Pakistan does not have the value of tolerance and non-violence which India has perpetuated for so long. Mr. Speaker, now coming to what have we told you, right, and what the case has been from both sides. the side government had to come and tell you that there will be some sort of necessary and tangible benefit the moment you pass this sort of a move. And they couldn't do so. Their only thing was that, okay, now like Subhash Chandra Bose will get the sort of like fame that he deserves and will get the sort of respect that he deserves. And like when we asked them that what will be the benefit of that to the society, there was absolutely no answer. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that Subhash Chandra Bose is like dead and gone. He doesn't need that respect. What people need right now are their lives, which will be lost the moment you make the society a more violent one and make the idea of violence something which is more acceptable to your national ethos and your national culture. And that, Mr. Speaker, is why I'm very proud to propose this.
Mr. Speaker, they wanted to push on us the burden that what is the tangible benefit to violent protests, and the example that they used to justify that violent protests are illegitimate is Maoists. I'll accept that challenge. I'll prove to you that if Maoists are actually being oppressed by the Indian government as much as the Britishers were being oppressed, they are legitimate to use violent means to oppress, to like actively like fight against these people, right? Because I don't see how absolute moral judgments on what kind of protest you need to engage in make sense in this case. Because if actually violent mechanisms in current context are seen as the last resort and all legislative and electoral means have failed for these people to engage into fruition and actual change, Maoists are absolutely justified. And this is exactly the words of an oppressor, right? That they aren't justified in engaging in any violent means because it disrupts our own social fiber and social fabric. They never take into cognizance the other side about how much oppression they are facing. It's absolutely justified, and that is why we need to prop up this idea of violence, right? The exact narrative that they are talking about how it's always an objective moral bad to engage in these mechanisms is the narrative that we want to break down. The narrative that exists today colors the fact about how you approach certain means. Every time you take a means that is deviant from the normal of non-violence is seen as bad, something that they want to sell to you. We completely and fundamentally disagree with that. Understand that when it's the last resort, you need to use visceral imagery of people dying and fighting against the oppressor. You need to use the power you need to use the mobilizing power of violence and people dying to get more people to your side so that you get support from these things. If they'd rather die in the crossfire against the Indian government than live to lead a life under the oppressed, then it's an absolutely legitimate case. We accept their challenge. We prove that. But understand that it's very easy for side government to come up and retroactively pass value judgments on what was necessary and an apt means to fight for change when there was no change that we saw in that world, right? Understand that all of these people, Chandrasekhar Azad, Bhagat Singh and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, took any means that was necessary to get us the room that we're sitting in today, freely debating this kind of a context, right? Understand that they took any kind of means that was necessary because they did not know what means would have worked, right? But some of these means did work, right? In the cases where Subhash Chandra Bose currently is demonized for his actions that he'd taken, right? We discredit, understand that it's their burden to prove to you that why we should actively discredit the actions of people who have continually engaged in the freedom struggle and have caused tangible benefits and have actively contributed to us gaining their independence. Under our paradigm, you don't do that. You downplay the idea of Ahimsa because it's the larger narrative that has existed in status quo, and you play up the idea of all of those people who have engaged in violent means in the specific context of freedom struggle is something that we're talking about. I don't see how argumentation about suddenly playing up these things in textbooks is going to make everyone more violent in this case, because it's a specific historical context under which this debate takes place. Understand, in today's world, like Subhash Chandra Bose is demonized because he was seen as like allying with the Japanese army to gain independence for the northeastern states. At the end of the day, that action resulted in the independence of the northeastern states. That is the reason why we have those northeastern states. You never hear about any of these things in history textbooks. The only thing that you hear about is Satyagraha and how that fruitioned into, I don't exactly know what it fruitioned into, but it didn't get us any active electorate or any active topography in that area. We think that those things are never played up where people actively contribute to these things, because people already have a jaded and preconceived notion about what means that you should use, right? That Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose will always be painted as someone who is violent, and therefore whatever actions that he committed and whatever he got as a consequence, we directly contrast the moral high ground of the act. We never understand what was the consequences consequences of those acts, which were in some cases positive, like in the cases of Subhash Chandra Bose, right? We see that this is the exact narrative that they want to paint you, that every time you take an action which probably isn't as like morally good as they want to paint to you, the action that results from that is something that is bad. We completely fundamentally disagree, because in a freedom struggle, like Arjun want to say to you, it wasn't a struggle, right? It was an actual fight, a war for independence, and in war you sometimes have to cross certain moral thresholds. You do that every day in general war, where the United States goes ahead and conducts drone strikes in the locations of the ISIS. You violate moral lines every day in war. We don't see why it's illegitimate to celebrate people who completely acted in the idea of war, like in the spirit of war, and gave people an independent state of India today, even if their actions weren't of Ahimsa. I'll take a POI.
So do you believe that every single demand for which things might get violent, for example Maoist or for example RSS asking for being banned, are as legitimate and necessary as Indian independence was?
Wait, I don't see how that makes sense. I'm just saying that the violent means of protest can sometimes be necessary and can sometimes be justified on the part of the person who is oppressed. We, as people who are oppressing them, can't pass a value judgment on what kind of a mechanism of protest they want to take or they don't want to take. Understand that there is a certain objective moral good with this Ahimsa thing that they want to claim. And the problem with absolute moral standards is that they don't work in the real world, right? Like my characterization of wars, right? Understand that this definitely did not work in the context of when you were actively being shot at by the British in the Jallianwala Bagh, or when you were actively being oppressed by the British by their huge army, right? We have a moral obligation to let the people of India know about the truth, about who are the people who actively fought for them in whatever mechanisms that were necessary to gain them the identity or to gain them the freedom struggle that was important, right? We don't, I understand this, their challenge to us was also that what is the tangible benefit to like historical basically what is the tangible benefit to history being accurate, right? Here's the tangible benefit. People craft their identity based on history. Understand? Yeah, exactly. They do craft their identity based on history, right? Which means that this takes away from people's ability to organically craft their identity and choose what form of protest they want to engage in. Which means that there has to be a Subhash Chandra Bose for another Mahatma Gandhi. We don't want to pass a value judgment on people who want to take those violent mechanisms in cases where they think that it is deemed necessary, or in cases non-violent mechanisms where it isn't deemed necessary. We as the state can't sell propaganda to people in the form of history, because understand that propaganda is an absolute bad, right? It's also a bad when it's sold for a good cause, right? And that is why we principally and morally reject the idea that you can paint history books in a unidimensional way where you only sell a certain propaganda that as the state you find is something that is beneficial in these cases. We think that Bose supporters should have the right to speak up for their moral causes just as much as Gandhi supporters do. They shouldn't be thrown to the fringes of society where they need to keep these ideals and hide from other people. We're extremely proud to do.
Mr. Speaker, at the very outset, we are not discrediting or passing a value judgment on the sort of ways or on the kinds of demands that you have. But yes, we do have a problem if the way of achieving those demands causes social upheavals to the extent that it sort of takes away lives, to the extent that it destroys society, to the extent that it takes away credibility of the government and puts our government in an unstable way. We don't think they have done any sort of justice in this debate in telling us as to why there isn't some sort of tangible benefit accruing from that side of the house, right? First of all, three essential questions that need to be asked in this debate for you to judge this. One, what is the present social contextualization, and in the 21st century, why that is very important in this debate. Secondly, this idea as to why and what is this concept of Ahimsa and why it forms the backbone of any society to function, and especially the Indian society to function in the best possible way. And thirdly and lastly, the most important, the consequential effect arising from both the sides. First of all, from this side, we get this inherent contradiction. They come here and tell us that, look, this idea is already intrinsically attached to the values of people. They sort of shut their jobs whenever government does anything wrong. But we think that there is an extension to that thing. When people shut their shops and kind of protest against the government, it extends to the point where they try to create riots, where they try to pellet stones, where they try to create forms of destructions, right? We think that actively in the 21st century, where violence is a very easy option for people to pick. Where any other problem that, like religious problems, cultural problems, these are some things that people intrinsically link themselves to. And the only easy option for them to do is to sort of pick their arms and go against the state or go against every other person. We think that's problematic, right? Why? Because when we come here and give you the example of Maoists, we are not passing a value judgment on Maoists. But essentially what we are saying is, if the trend of Maoism is something picked on in the Indian society, it becomes problematic for our entire Indian society. It becomes problematic for the entire government, because this entire debate is about two questions. One, how India panned out after 1947 and how we want India to pan out after 2016, right? We think when India panned out after 1947, this entire idea as to us not picking arms, this idea about us valuing certain values to which we are not going to destroy and encroach upon other people's liberties and go into the non-violent ways is something essential, because we think non-aligned movement was essentially functional on that base, right? We think India panned itself, carved its policies and moved forward in that particular way. It sort of saw all of its benefits accruing in that particular manner, right? Secondly, we think in the 2016 narrative, when everyone goes on like a war, when they see people eating beef, in the narrative where people sort of see these casteist things existing in the society, they just go and hit people, right? We think that's problematic, because there are ways essentially in which society is supposed to be curtailed, the way in which society is supposed to pan out, and this panning out is something which is essential because it sort of lays down into how we historically developed and we were given birth to, right? We think this idea as to this concept of ahimsa is really important, because we believe that this inculcating of values of violence or values of non-violence essentially subconsciously puts a kind of burden on us as to whether we are supposed to go to that extreme step or not, whether we are supposed to reconsider that position or not. Why to the very extreme? Why should I always go ahead with arms or guns and take something that I want to or I deserve, but reconsider or think of a better opportunity to which the society is not destroyed, or to which any other person is not killed, right? We think they haven't engaged at all or told us as to why this other huge chunk of people who are not attached to this, as to why these people who will necessarily be affected by this huge growing trend of violence will necessarily see that alignment. Your question.
Your hypothesis that more people suddenly take up violent means when we encourage violence is lie, because people automatically die in the crossfire when they take violent means. Why is it violent means justified as a last resort?
Yeah, we do not as a side tell you that history books sort of take away violence as an option from people's life. We do not. But we tell you why that important and why that factor should essentially be a propelling force and should continuously exist in our lives to tell us and reconsider every action that we take in our lives, right? Why it is essential for every person to sort of reconsider his position and look at the other position and sort of see these values freely flowing, right? We think that's essential because you sort of see as to how a society will eventually see itself in the next 1 decade or the coming 2 decades, right? We think that this responsibility of how we want our society to become after a certain point of time is also essential in this debate, and you need to justify as to why we suddenly pick out on all these notions of violence. Will suddenly people not pick on them, considering that violence is something that people necessarily attribute to, something that people necessarily see as an easy option, something that they will go for necessarily, right? We think second to this point, which they haven't even flashed, is this idea of ahimsa does not come in isolation. British government was something that a man could do it. We think this debate has never panned out to this idea about irreverence being caused, because we don't think that in the status quo any sort of irreverence is being caused. We think that this idea is essentially there because when history books sort of relate to satyagraha or these ideas ahimsa, it needs a more nuanced approach to subconsciously put it into the minds of people. What is the value of it, or what is the benefit accruing from these values, right? Second to this idea as to what is the USP of India on the international level, which they haven't engaged at all, right? India, right from its birth in 1947 till 2016, has always been a country which has been based on this idea of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, or this idea as to we cannot first pick up the arms. And we think that when they say us that visceral imagery of violence is needed for people to achieve their ends, they haven't given us one example as to how India will necessarily benefit when they get this idea of violence, right? We think that this idea of how our trade relations panned out, as to how we contributed to the international community, how as every other country today views India, why Our democracy is something which is glorified and given as an example to every other country where violence exists were the answers of this debate, which they haven't at all answered. The consequential effect arising out of this, if this was the debate from that side, we think the only thing we've got from this side of the house is one, irreverence being caused, and secondly is this weird thing which came out in the second and the third speeches, is the idea that tangible benefits can also accrue from their sides. One, to this idea of history being narrated. We think that it's completely correct if the history has to be narrated for the benefit of the society. If history has to be narrated from the point of view of curtailing the society to the point that it doesn't take away or harm our society or doesn't harm the future of our country, right? Unless you give answers to that question, we don't think you've done any sort of justice to this motion. Secondly, to this idea, when they come here to tell you that we have sort of delegitimized other people like Subhash Chandra Bose and all of these people, we think that it's quite necessary for us to understand why the society is the prime stakeholder in this debate. We think that should be the metric of your judging, because we essentially see that any kind of move that the country sorts to make it effective is effectively worked out on planks of this notion as to why the society will benefit. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud.
Mr. Speaker, three basic questions to this debate, right? The first one, which is integral to any PD. What is the burden of the House? The burden of side government here was to come here and tell you that there will be some tangible, some beneficial thing that will arise out of this move that they are proposing, right? And there has been a weird case shift from the first speech to the third speech. Because in the first speech they said that, well, historical narrative is something which must necessarily need to be accurate, and we must respect, Subhash Chandra Bose is respective of the fact if it legitimizes violence and all that sort of stuff. Except in the third speech they now come and say that, no, now other means of violence also need to be legitimate, and other people who support Subhash Chandra Bose also need to be legitimate, and I was really at no point clear with what their tangible harm is, right? So anyways, I'll talk about both. The first one, that historical narrative needs to be accurate. We have absolutely no analysis as why historical narrative is something which must be accurate if it can be manipulated for greater state good, greater social good, for saving people's lives. And secondly, other forms of protests must also be legitimized. Absolutely no rebuttal to that as to why people dying for any sort of thing, if their means of protest is killing people, and if their means of protest is something which result in social upheaval, are something which are necessary, right? Mr. Speaker, now coming to the more important questions of this debate. A, why will violence be legitimized the moment you sort of devalue the sort of idea of non-violence in this community? Mr. Speaker, the context of 2016 becomes extremely relevant. When I tell you that schisms in the society are currently exist, which are huge, right? People are ideologically against each other even in their dietary habits. Mr. Speaker, we tell you when these sort of schisms in the society exist, the moment you take away this ideological counter narrative which runs into you, this ideological disincentive which runs in the society, that our country is something which our country is something which was based on non-violence, our country is something which was based on tolerance. We tell you, give them absolutely no disincentive to go out and burn and riot at every single stage that they want to. Mr. Speaker, also, right, we tell you that this idea will be further legitimized because if you glorify Subhash Chandra Bose and Chandrasekhar Azad as much as you glorify Gandhi, then taking out dharnas, which are a legitimate means right now, will be as legitimate as forming an army and starting a civil war in the country, which Subhash Chandra Bose did. That ideology is not always right? Freedom movement was regarded globally as a legitimate, a cause that is necessary to be fought for, a cause that you must have. Except do you think that has the same value as the idea and as the protest in which beef ban is done, right? The fact that RSS believes that cow is something which is extremely holy to Hindu culture, do you believe that in that case also violence should be a legitimate means of protest? We tell you no clash to that. Mr. Speaker, what will be the effect of legitimization of violence as a means of protest? A, domestic, B, international. The moment you see this domestically, people will try to emulate Subhash Chandra Bose as they try to emulate Mahatma Gandhi. We tell you that will cause violence. We tell you legitimization of certain means of protests can't be done if those means of protest are causing greater societal harm to property and life in your country, which are ruining your economy, which are ruining your international image. How is the international image of India ruined? India's USP has always been of non-violence, the non-aligned movement, the fact that we have a no first use policy and all that sort of stuff. It lets the globe have trust in us. It lets the globe deal with us despite without fearing this idea that if we piss off India, then they will screw with us in a very bad way. The reason that Israel and America are vilified is because the moment they feel displeased, the moment they feel that, you know what, something bad is happening to us, they go and drop bombs. There is one Hamas rocket launcher which comes into the Iron the Iron Dome, and the whole of Palestine is captured. We tell you Israel is vilified for that. We are considering cultural boycott of them. We tell you that is not an India I want to live in, and hence I'm very proud to oppose this.
The problem with retroactively creating narratives is that it's easy to claim the high ground and view all actions through a lens of morality, right? But the issue is that the way we need to judge these actions is in a hugely different social context, right? One where Indians were oppressed to a large extent by an empire that continued to appropriate their culture on a daily basis. Which is why we tell you that although Ahimsa did have its benefits in the way that it did get independence to some extent, we tell you that it wasn't the sole contributing factor in the way that India was able to get independence, right? We think the problem is when you, at the point at which you continue to overplay the narrative of Ahimsa, it necessarily discredits, delegitimizes, and places an implicit value judgment and a tone of admonishment on the other forms of protest, something that we find problematic. The only supposed tangible benefit that they spoke about, and this was something that their entire case was hinged upon, right, was the idea that it's possible to condition society on the basis of these narratives. We tell you that it's a little bit of a problem, where on one hand, they argue, like, we have to understand this, right? Status quo is one wherein Ahimsa is glorified, which means that if they wanted to see the benefits of less people indulging in acts of violence, then we should have already been able to see these benefits right now, which is what we pointed out to you throughout. We're not really seeing that, but instead, the tension in their case was also one to suggest that in fact, we're seeing an increasing trend of non-violence. We asked opposition what their stance on the issue is. Are people becoming more tolerant by glorifying this culture or Ahimsa, or do we not see any tangible benefit altogether? And we tell you that the problem with that is this, right? At the point at which you delegitimize all other forms of protest, it necessarily takes away from the impact that it could possibly have. Because we do think riots, demonstrations, and violent protests could have a huge impact in the way that earlier Indians were able to throw oppressive government structures, right? But moreover, we tell you that we didn't let them get away with this characterization that violence will necessarily be the first resort, right? Because it isn't easy engaging in violent protests at the point at which there are tangible harms to you and your life in itself, right? We think also there exists several legal barriers from you acting like as violently as they would have you believe, right? So we don't really see the one premise that entire case was hinged on actually being proven at all, right? But understand this, right? We think maybe non-violence was something that we needed back then, right? We understand that that could have been an intrinsic part of society, like part of the Indian society, maybe in the 1940s, but that isn't to suggest that we necessarily need it now to the extent that opposition would have you believe, to the extent where they tell you that every single action of ours is going to be inspired by a culture of non-violence. Which means that at worst, if this situation is a deadlock, or at best we tell you that it isn't going to lead to the kind of culture that they spoke about, they had to engage with us on the paradigm of what is the role of narratives in society and books. Because it's not only insulting, Mr. Speaker, that the first question they ask you in their first speech is what is the role of celebrating these freedom fighters in itself. We think it's morally abhorrent for them to overly discredit the same kinds of people that we should be revering, right? Because it's incredulous on one hand for them to suggest that we should emulate one person and condition society along the lines of this one person, but at the same time not pay any sort of reverence to other other actors who are just as much of an important contributing factor in the way that we're able to live our lives today, right? And the way we told you in terms of why we think these actors were just as important in us achieving this independence was them necessarily providing this viscerality and jolt to the extent where the British Empire also realized that there was a huge problem in the way that they were functioning, right? We think the ability for these people to galvanize support and actually fight out against the Britishers was one that was necessarily provided by actors who didn't engage in a culture of Ahimsa, but one who also did co-opt in ideas of non-violence in itself, right? We think they largely discredited the sacrifices that these violent actors made. And we told you that's the problem. They're victims of the same sort of conditioning that we want to move away from, right? Because we think that there is enough of a benefit being shown in terms of us understanding that there is also a necessity to move away from non-violent forms of protest and legitimizing violence. We don't want this to be just a struggle of independence anymore. We need to let people know that this was a war of independence and something that was fought using a variety of tools from our basket. For these reasons, incredibly positive.